So, talking about certification and the test suite in rather more detail. So I want to talk about what we've done, what we're planning in the short term and what we plan in the long term for the test suite, and certification, both the current status and future plans. Now the third thing that is on the agenda is a feedback session. I've merged the two because this presentation gives you the background and gives you the questions anyway that it would be interesting to get feedback on, and also the audience on this call, on this meeting, is rather different to the one we had originally envisaged, and it's still good to get everybody's feedback, but it's not the feedback we originally thought we might get from this meeting, which was specifically from the vendors, and we've got very few vendors involved in this meeting. But I'm really interested in feedback from all the universities who are on, the smaller development companies and so on. So I've rolled the two together. So, Test Suite version 0.1.1. We demonstrated 0.1.0 last year at this meeting. We released 0.1.1 in February 2022, where we had closed 33 open tickets, so we made some significant improvements. They were both defects and enhancements. We incorporated some of the feedback from the last year's annual meeting, and we added additional tests for the property package. I will point out that those tests that we added were based on a first pass analysis of the requirements. They weren't exhaustive or approved, they were not documented, and what we've done since I'll cover in more detail later on. But what that gave us was a version that we could release for review. And last year we had 5 organisations who volunteered to review the software, which was ChemSep, HGRI, Lindy, ProSim, Syntef, and I think we've only got Lindy and ProSim on this call, have we? Is Olaf on, Michelle?
Yeah, Alain Vacher and I guess other people from, Alain Vacher is on the call, and 2 other people from ProSim are supposed to be on the call as well.
Yes, Alain is here.
Hi there, Alain. So, interject if I say anything wrong or you want to add more. But I haven't actually said which reviewer is which in the feedback. I've just called you reviewers 1, 2, 3 because I didn't want to. There's some stuff in here that you might not want out in the open. So, reviewer 1 gave us usability feedback. A lot of usability feedback. It was captured as tickets, which are all currently open. We haven't addressed any of that feedback yet. Reviewer 2, when it was tested on a property package, we found a defect. It might have been 2 defects in the test suite, which caused the test suite to fail, which we immediately fixed during the review process, and a new version, a new patch was made available, and then the property package tested successfully and passed all tests. So the review was really useful because it found a defect in the test suite, and then it demonstrated that the implementation based on the tests that had been implemented in the test suite so far was actually good. We then went, and the third reviewer, again we had a defect in the test suite causing a failure, but the next two things actually go hand in hand, because the reason we had a failure was because there was a defect in the property package implementation, which when that exercised the test suite, it caused the failure in the test suite. So without the failure in the property package, we would have never found a defect in the test suite, interestingly. But we fixed it, new version was made available, and yep, the property package failed at least one of the tests. I think it actually failed 2 tests. And the vendor has addressed the issue, and a new version of that property package has been released by the vendor. So, yep, we've got updates from one reviewer, future updates from one reviewer. We found some defects in the test suite, which is totally expected. We're not going to write perfect code straight out the box. But one of those reviewers actually found a problem with their own property package, which has now been corrected. So the test suite has immediately proved its value. The whole just gives some evidence that the whole idea behind it and what we're trying to do is actually worthwhile. So yeah, the review was successful. We identified some critical defects in the test suite and fixed them. We've identified future improvements, and the non-compliance to the standard was identified and fixed. Okay, so that was the review. Got really valuable feedback for everybody from that. So moving on to documentation of tests. And you have to say the test suite will only be as good as the tests it contains. If we don't write the tests correctly, or we don't have a full set of tests, we ain't going to test everything. And the interoperability SIG or the CO-LaN software development contractors can't write those, can't document those tests themselves. They can assist, but they can't write them. The documenting of those tests has to be the responsibility of the SIG, which owns the interface. Hence, Method and Tools doing the documentation for identification. The thermodynamic SIG will need to do the property package and property package manager documentation. Unit will need to do the unit documentation. So there is a requirement for significant input from the SIGs here. So M&T have developed a template for documenting the tests, and in the joint meetings has been reviewed by the interoperability SIG. So we have a template for documenting, which, as I already said, uses identification interface as an example, which covers compliancy and some best practice. And there's at least one area still under debate within the M&T SIG, and I'm not going to claim that I know it all. What it is, something around secondary objects.
Component name. Component name.
I'm sorry?
Component name of secondary objects.
Component name of secondary objects. Thank you, Michael. So yeah, there is still some work there, and because it's been done on identification, there is certainly the template will need to be expected when we get to things like unit, which have variable numbers of ports, and so on. So you've got variable number of objects associated with it, and so the template will need to be extended. And some open questions here about the documentation, which we will come back to in the question and answer, the feedback session. Do we need to go through an RFC process for the test documentation? Does it need to go outside the SIG and interoperability SIG, the SIG plus the interoperability SIG that have developed and reviewed it? I don't know. Should the final version of the document for each interface be available to CO-LaN members? I believe I know the answer, but I'd be interested in feedback. And should they be made public, outside the CO-LaN membership, which is a different question. Very definitely a different question. We'll come back to those questions later on. So having developed a template for documentation of tests and having the tests for identification, what we then did is we started to develop the tests for property packages. Now, the first step should normally be done by the relevant SIG, and I've deliberately used all those three words. We need to generate a preliminary list of the tests that are required, and that has been done by Michelle in lieu of the SIG in the interests of getting through this process. And this preliminary list of tests is not just a list, it includes the background and other relevant information that Michel, with his deep knowledge of the standards, is able to write. And that preliminary list has then been reviewed by Jasper, again in lieu of the SIG. He's done that with his SIG hat on, but independent from the SIG. We've then done a detailed documentation of a subset of those tests that have been listed. And this whole process was not about producing a complete set of tests for property packages, but was to understand the process we need to follow to generate the documentation of the tests before they're implemented in the test suite. So hence we did detailed documentation of a subset of the property package tests in the list to gain experience of how long it takes, and that was done by Marcus Bruno from Siondo, who's one of our software development contractors. And Jasper then reviewed that detailed documentation again with his SIG hat on, effectively. Then Marcus took the documented tests, including the identification documentation, and implemented them all in the current version of the test suite. And Jasper has actually done some review of those implemented tests. I don't think that review, I think more needs to be done in the fullness of time, but he has reviewed the implemented tests.
Well, there's some overlap there. Some of the feedback was already given during the documentation stage.
Yes.
So then clearly the actual implementation stage needs to take into account that.
Yes. Yes. What Jasper was actually saying there was we were running things in parallel. Marcus started implementing before Jasper had done the review of the documentation, and he found some issues with the documentation which then had to be redone in the implementation. In an ideal world, you do it sequentially. But in the interest of time, we might find ourselves implementing before the review of the documentation is complete, and then modifying the implementation. And it may well, it's a more time, more hours spent, but less elapsed time. And I suspect the elapsed time one is more important to get things done. So that's what we've done on testing for property packages. And some statistics. So Michel defined 42 tests for property package. And I believe, Jasper, Michel, that's not quite a complete list. There's one of the interfaces isn't done. Well, at least one of the interfaces isn't done yet.
The biggest interface isn't done. I get thermal property routine.
Okay. So there will be more than 42 tests, which immediately puts it into context as to how many tests are required for each of these interfaces. Marcus then fully documented 13 of those and has implemented 22 tests in the test suite covering identification and property package. And to put this into context, the time spent, Michel, you took about 40 hours producing that list with the background information. Marcus then took 20 hours to turn that into the full documents and implement. And Jasper, you spent about 2 hours on review. And I suspect that's actually gone up because that, without the review work you did last week.
About 3 hours.
Yeah, so it's actually more than 2 hours. But that actually means that it's somewhere between 1 and 2 hours required of man hours per test. So if an interface, if say thermo property package is in total 100 tests, there's something up between 100 and 200 hours of work just to document and implement those tests. We are talking about a non-insignificant amount of work. And an awful lot of that work was done by Michel and Jasper on behalf of the ThermoSig in the interest of finding out how long these things take, but for future documentation it needs to be done by the SIGs. And I have a concern that that will have an effect on the delivery of the test suite for certification, because in best will in the world, the members of the SIGs are working in their, what I would call, spare time. It's not a full-time activity for them. It's when they find time to do these things, and it's going to take time to do this. It's going to take elapsed time to do this review. So our delivery of certification tests in the test suite is going to be limited. The speed of delivery is going to be limited by the amount of time the SIGs can give to this. And I saw from Richard's report that the unit SIG is effectively on hold at the moment, but yet we're asking the unit SIG to do a significant chunk of work here.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
So, more to you, Jasper, because you are deeper into the technical stuff. Is it not possible to automate this to a certain extent? So, in a sense of, let's say, if you test whether an interface is implemented or not, I think there's more than one test for testing an interface is present or not, but it's always the same procedure to test this.
But this is a two-line test. A test like that doesn't take 2 hours to make up, of course. Not to mention that that test has 2 outcomes. Is it a required interface or not? Gives you a different outcome for test.
Yeah.
Essentially, all of that needs to be judged and documented. But it is also a learning curve. If we have documented 3 interfaces, the 4th and the 5th one will go easier, of course. Particularly because there's a bit of overlap there.
Yep.
But implementation of does this particular interface exist to recycle that is variable point. That's really truly a two-line test.
Yeah, but this was exactly my point. So if, let's say, just to simplify it, stay with the whether an interface is implemented or not, even if it is required or not required. Okay, so you have 2 use cases for this situation, but if you have implemented the test first time for it, and then you simply needs to copy paste, let's say, the documentation, the test itself. You need to modify the name of the interface for sure, but
we do that, of course. Yes.
yeah.
But I think that is just
maybe
that's probably you're referring to. Yes, you probably could automate that one, but it's the simplest of the possible tests, and it's a very small number of tests out of the total.
Yeah.
And I think my next slide might address this a little bit as well.
Yeah, automating is maybe the wrong word, but let's say
Yeah.
make use of the repetition. Putting that way.
A quote. And of course, I'm not going to name you, Michelle. Specifications not written to enable testing. It's Michelle's conclusion from documenting 42 tests for the property package. But it's actually very difficult to generate the tests from the specification. Now, I personally have an immediate reaction to that. Is if they're difficult to document tests from the specifications, how easy is it to actually implement from the specifications?
That should actually be easier. It is identifying all the things that you should comply with, because they live in textual requirements, they live in interface descriptions, they live in use cases, and if they didn't make it into the original document, they might live in the right-hand clarification.
But if you don't know what the things are you've got to meet, I can't remember your exact words, but if you can't identify those simply, somebody just writing an interface from scratch isn't going to know what they need to do.
Yes.
So to me, if you can't write the test simply from the specification, then you can't actually, it makes it more difficult to write interfaces for somebody who's not familiar with the specifications inside out.
But now you're heading in the direction of a totally different discussion that has been alive in the MNT SIG for a while. And that is, we want to go to more or less a document management system where the specification and the IDL that goes with it, and preferably also the testing that goes with it, is centralized into one type of document, maybe XML or whatnot, and the Word and the PDF and the IDL and the tests documentation we generate.
I'm not trying to give solutions here, though. Just saying.
Future music.
Yeah, this is a serious concern. And also, the current specifications are not always clear. It's quite difficult to get a full understanding of the specifications, and hence it's difficult to implement properly. There are some instances where the specifications are incomplete and open to interpretation. Therefore, what the writing of the test documentation is, let alone implementing in the test suite, but what the writing of the test documentation is doing is identifying shortcomings in the specification documents, the textual specifications. So not only do we need these SIGs to document the tests, but our belief is that we're going to have to start writing more errata and clarification documents where we find issues with the specifications when we try and write the test documentation.
Which is, of course, also very valuable outcome of this exercise.
Yeah. So even before we have a test suite with tests in it that's available for people to use, writing the test documentation should improve the textual specifications, because we're identifying the shortcomings in the textual specifications that's never been done. So just the actual step of documenting tests is valuable to the Cape Open community, very valuable to the Cape Open community.
Yeah. While I would put this a little bit in different words, I totally agree with this, but we did internally at Linde also a similar exercise with one of our process simulators. So I think what we need to tackle, and this goes directly in your direction with the XML document, to make the textual specification, which are human readable, to make something out of it that is also machine readable.
Yes.
And machine processable. To the direction to documentation, to the direction of tests, and in a sense of implementation of these standards.
The ideal, yes.
Yeah. And I think this is an exercise possibly we need to do after we have implemented now the test suite,
Yes.
but make it consistent, let's say, and machine readable, and this maybe also goes directly into your direction.
Yeah, because it's about
Mapping.
how you structure your requirements in a way which make them easy transfer between text and machine.
I think that's one for the M&T, not interoperability. I'll pass the buck on that one.
It's
That's what me and
Malcolm, I'll add that is on our ever-growing list.
Could you repeat that, Bill?
Yeah, I will say that is on our ever-growing list. We've been talking about finding some documentation platform, but just haven't had an opportunity to get beyond the talking about it stage. So
M&T has an awful lot on its plate already. Thank you, Bill. Okay, I just wanted to revisit the structure of the tests as they're implemented in the test suite, because we have made some changes since last year, at least in naming. So we have three levels. We have the test library, we have the test categories, and we have tests. So the test library is one test library per component type. For example, a property package. So you will have a property package test library. That is a change of name from what we presented last year, which was compliancy tests, because what we realized was it contains both compliancy and best practice. So calling them compliance tests is actually incorrect. Each test library will contain a number of test categories, which is a collection of tests per interface. And I think there were some slightly interpretable words in there last year, but now a test category is a collection of tests per interface. So identification has a set of tests. Property package has a set of tests. And that test category will be reused where an interface is applicable to multiple objects. So identification, the test category identification, will be reused for both property package and unit operation.
For every test, in fact, because that's required.
Yeah. I was just giving an example of two. But yeah, everything requires identification. So the identification test category will be used in every test library. And we will have separate test categories for, it's not on this slide, but we will have separate test categories for certification, compliance, and best practice. So you can run just the compliance tests or the best practice tests, or both. So when we get to certification, you only have to prove you meet the compliance tests, not the best practice tests. They will be kept separately in different test categories to make it easier just to run the compliance tests. And then we obviously, within every test category, we have a set of tests. Oliver?
Practical question, is it either or question whether a test is a compliancy test or a best practice test, or could it be both at the same time? One test for compliancy and for best practice?
Now, my
Or
understanding
is it
is
always separated?
they're always
One or the
separate.
other?
Yes, you have
So
to
we-
pass all the compliance tests to get your stamp. And the best practice test, you do not have to pass for that.
So they must by definition be separate.
Okay. So then certification will finally be based only on compliancy and not necessarily on
Best practice, yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Good.
So, I am now, for my sins, how am I doing on time? I'm doing fine. What have I got till 4:15? Yes, I've got another hour, plenty of time. I'm going to attempt a live demo of version 0.2.0 of the test suite, which could be fun. Let me get rid of that. Hopefully that sends that one blank. Probably got to stop sharing it, haven't I, to share something else. Probably easiest. Share my desktop. Let me. So, since last year, people who were here last year may remember that we had to start a command prompt, navigate to the correct folder, add something into the path, and all sorts of things like that. So now we just go, keep open test suite, keep open test suite command prompt, and we're suddenly there. Hoping that resolution is sufficient for people to be able to see. So, me look it that way, and where's it gone? There it is. Something I prepared earlier, my set of commands, just to make life easy. So I'm going to navigate to the correct folder, and the first thing I'm going to do is run the version command on it, just to prove that we can do versioning. If you run the version command on it, you get 0.2.0.0 on both the command line driver, which is what I'm just running, i.e. CLI command line interface, and the test suite engine itself is 0.2.0.0. So we're on a new version and it's all compatible. We still have help. That lists all the commands. There are some open tickets on making sure that help is completely consistent and everything works. So the first thing I'm going to do is generate a configuration file, a default one, which we have a command line. And what happened there? Why did that not work? There we go, that's better. So now I've generated a file config.txt in this folder, and if I so basically it says which Cape Open version it's referring to. Currently does not have a class ID for the component that's under test because we haven't defined it yet. So it is basically just a template file that we can now edit. So now what I will do first though is I will show you what tests we have available. So this first command shows us the test libraries. So we have one for property package. Without the word compliance on there by default, if it's got the word on there of compliance, it is compliance. But we've got best property package, best practice, and we've got unit operation. The unit operation tests are very slim because we've been focusing on property package. So then if I look at the property package test library, we can see we have test categories of identification, universal constants, and material context. So we are testing the identification interface, the universal constants interface, and the material context interface. And that is as far as we have currently got. And if I look at best practice, select it. We have a best practice for universal constants. So we actually do have at least one best practice test in here already, which came out of as Michel was writing the list of tests, he had a compliancy test, and at the same time he identified, oh, there's a best practice around this, which is not compliance, but it needs to be documented. So at the same time as doing the compliancy test, he was able to document the requirement for a best practice test. So it's not that you do all the compliance tests for an interface first and then you go back and do the best practice. They come out at the same time, but they are separate tests. And if I look at unit operation, we have identification again. As I said, it should appear in every test library. Test category should appear in every test category. Not sure. But we also have a unit operation test category. Should appear in every test library, shouldn't it? Yes. So, now having shown you what test categories are available, and created a template config.txt file, I can now edit it. And this pops up a Windows interface. This is Windows interface only, so this will not run on Unix, although in principle the test suite will run under Unix. So I give it any identifier I like. So we'll get rid of that default one. We're going to test library property package, but if I go in there, we've got property package, we've got property package best practice, and we've got unit operation. So I'm going to start with property package. And that contains identification, universal constants, material context, as I've already shown you. So I am then going to select the property package T, the property package manager T, and then I can select a property package. And I'm going to use the alkanes property package. And in there we can immediately open up the each test category and see the tests that are in there. So there are the 9 for identification, and there's 2 for universal constants, and 3 for material context. So that is the tests that will be run for this property package. We still have the configure test category, which is where if the test requires a temperature or pressure or anything like that, is where you input it. But since none of these tests now need configuration, I'm not going to try and demonstrate. I demonstrated it to you last year with the old tests that have now been replaced. But I can't demonstrate it this year because we don't have a test that needs configuration. So I'm going to ignore that one. I'm certainly going to ignore configure PMC. So we have now updated config.txt file, and if I go back to it, now we see an awful lot more data. So we can see the component name, type, property package, we're running the test library property package, and then loads of data. And I don't claim to understand that at all. So that is now configured so we can run a test.
That data is the private data stored by T. T can store to a property bag, so you can actually store the data in a readable manner, but typically you would expect PNC to store to a IPsys stream, in which case you will just see a long binary stream.
Okay.
It's the configuration data of the PNC.
50. Okay, thank you, Jasper. And if, for example, no, perhaps I've just done that. So let me run that config file. Okay, let me enlarge that. So I've just now run the test suite on the alkanes property package from T for the property package test library, i.e. the current certification tests. And you can see there the identification tests, all with OK after them, material context with OK after them, universal constants. One of them's failed. Jasper's raising his eyebrows over there. And then we get on the screen, we get some more failure information, and it's talking about, where's it gone? In there somewhere, ideal gas state reference pressure, unknown universal constant name. It's been raised as a failure. That's interesting. Have I got a problem with the test suite? Let me just go back, and so we not only do we have it in the command window, but we also have generated a JSON file here, which has a bug in, and there is a defect in the test suite, and it reports the component name as the T property package manager, not the name of the property package. And again, it gives you all the information about the test category it came from, and whether it passed or failed. And there again, we've got the failure and the failure information in a JSON file, so it can be parsed and used in other applications. And interestingly, Jasper investigated this and has identified a defect in T, which will be fixed by Monday, I think he said, at a new release. Now it's in a part of the code that's never been exercised by anybody, which is why nobody's found it before. But, so that's the second failure we found in a Cape Open implementation in two different applications now. One in the review process and one in my testing of the installation and the demo last week. It is working. This effort is worthwhile.
Yeah.
And I think that is incredibly important. Because with Colt we could see what was going wrong when things went wrong, but we weren't doing exhaustive testing of everything because you weren't exercising every part of the implementation. The idea of the test suite is it implements every part of the implementation. And so we'll find the things that have never actually been used yet, which might come back and bite us in the future. So I shared that one with Jasper last week, and we deliberately decided to leave it in. It demonstrates the value of the test suite, really does.
Yeah.
Not what I was expecting, I have to say, but incredibly useful that it does show that. And even the best written code has defects in it.
So what is the issue? The capital I in ideal? Or?
No. The ideal gas state reference pressure was added well after the fact of the initial thermo standard. And I added it to 1.0 get universal constant, but I overlooked adding it to 1.1. So it would work in 1.0, but in 1.1 it's just not there. It gives I don't know this constant. It's in the list of constants, but it's not in the evaluation of the constants.
Okay, fair enough.
So that, I think, unless anybody asks me to demonstrate anything else, no, it doesn't end, sorry, no, it doesn't end my demonstration. There was something else I wanted to try. I'm going to go back and edit the config file again and just demonstrate where have you gone? There you go. I'm just going to change it to property package best practice. And here we have a best practice on 3 things. We have 3 best practice tests in there. So if I OK that and then I run it again, I should do that just by bringing it back, shouldn't I? I won't show you the JSON file this time. All 3 best practice tests have passed, no failures. But I run the best practice tests independent from the property package compliance tests. The 2 things are separate. Am I going to try this, Jasper? I've not tried this. Shall I run this on a unit operation and just see what happens?
There's no useful tests in there, there's no point.
So identification will work?
Yeah, that will work.
Yeah, so okay. There's no point running it on unit operation because there are no useful tests. So that does end my demo unless anybody asks me to try anything else. The rest of the stuff I showed last year is unchanged. The filtering, being able to run independent, separate tests, so that if you've tested, a test fails and you want to rerun just that test and not go through all the tests, you can filter and just tell it to run 1 test. That has not changed since last year. That ability is still there. We still have the command line driver, which can be integrated into any software. We have the G-test driver, which can be integrated into Visual Studio. And the purpose of the drivers is that people can write their own drivers, but that gives you the basic 2. That means you can integrate this and automate the use of the test suite into your own testing software, development processes, and so on.
So you can do test-driven development.
Yes, yes. So I think that ends my demo. I'm not hearing anything from online, so I've got to stop sharing, haven't I? So I want to share what? That one. And bring that one back. Okay. I think I'm doing okay here. Let's go back to full screen. That's the demo. So, short-term plans. We will action all the open tickets, creating version 0.2.1. And the plan is to action them all. We decided not to try and prioritise, we're just going to get rid of them all. And that will be this year. We will then release 0.2.1 to vendors again. Vendors, anybody who wants to try it, in fact, not limited to vendors, gather feedback, but it will have no additional tests over 0.2.0. So it will still only, it's really, HRI had the problem that they were struggling to review because it didn't have any unit operation tests in there. So it's probably people with property package managers that want to test, want to review, and we're not here testing your implementations necessarily, we're testing the work process of using the test suite.
But having some of the process simulator...
I was about to try it myself, actually. Huh?
Have you tried it?
No, but I was about to.
So, but we will wait. Yeah, we will wait until 0.2.1, so all these tickets have been addressed before we share it with you.
Okay.
And we'll share it again with the vendors, the people who offered last time round.
Who's online? I think ProSim is there. Do you consider to test it?
Yes, we are already to test the next version. Yes.
Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Alain. And then the next step after that will be to fully document and implement compliancy and best practice tests for property package. I'll put Q1 2023 on there. I think that's probably a stretch target, given that we'll need significant input from the thermosig, both documentation and review of documentation.
If I rough idea how much effort it is to complete thermal PMC?
I'm looking at Jasper. We've done 40 odd tests. There's probably
You're
many as
getting
that
another
again.
40, 50, 60
Yeah.
tests.
Yeah. So, given it took us 40, it took us 60 odd hours to do those 40 tests. We haven't documented and implemented them all. There's, say, 60 tests to do from scratch, 20 tests to do to document and implement. So we're looking at 150, 200 hours. 150, 200 hours.
And that's excluding parameter support, but nobody implements parameters. So formally it should be there. In practice, it's not a big loss if we don't have that in our first release.
Okay. But it sounds doable, let's say.
Yes,
Within.
but the problem will not, I don't think the hours is the problem, it's the amount of time that the thermosig can devote to it,
So
and when they can make
if Michelle
themselves.
would make this effort, we could speed it up.
Well, if Michelle and Jasper are willing to make the effort as members of the SIG but independent from the SIG, but I still think the SIG needs to finally sign off on those documents. They've got to be familiar with them. Because it's got to be the SIG that signs off on those testing
Absolutely,
documents.
but I mean also now for the tests which are implemented right now.
Yeah.
Michelle did the main
Yes.
work, right?
Yes,
For
indeed.
sorting it out
Indeed.
and putting it in the right form. and
Yes.
Marcus implemented
Yeah,
it.
and then Marcus has done a lot of work on documenting and implementing.
So that
we-
also requires
we-
approval of the thermosig.
Everything that's been done so far needs the approval of the thermosig. Yes, indeed. Because we can't release something that is looking at the thermo specification without the thermosig approving what we're releasing.
So what is about with the unit SIG trying already to prepare a little bit for this? Because that's the next that should be done. So if the SIGs, let's say, have a remarkable amount of work, does it make sense to ask the unit SIG already to start on this work for the unit PMC tests?
If the unit SIG is active and wants to, has time to do that, absolutely. Because long-term plans document and implement compliance and best practice tests for unit operation by the end of next year. So there is a significant effort there required from the unit SIG as well.
Yeah, but I think it's not reasonable to wait until...
No, exactly. Yeah, it's not. We do not need.
There
There's no need to do them consecutively.
Because the proof of concept is there and
Yes.
it works. So
Yeah, we have the template. We have proof of concept. We have a working test suite that they can look at. So there is absolutely no reason why the unit SIG can't start that listing and documenting process now.
Plus the effort to document is substantially larger than the effort to implement. So
Yeah.
we can probably fit the implementation in any case.
and, but now they can start with it and have maybe 6 months or 12 months to prepare and until real implementation of the test starts.
Yes.
But then we have already something and
Yeah, exactly.
get released.
But that is probably linked to your meeting of the SIG.
Absolutely.
In a
we
couple
have
of
to
weeks'
put it on the
time.
agenda and
So
have
if
to
you could
discuss
put that on the
surveyability.
Yeah.
And it looks like if we want to progress or accelerate this effort, then we need perhaps somebody
Well, I'm not
who's
sure-
really doing
I'm
a
not sure
dedicated
that-
effort like Michelle did.
What you're talking
So that's
about
what
will
we
not
have to
necessarily
discuss.
accelerate that end 2023, but it will enable us to meet that end 2023. I think it's probably required to meet that deadline.
Yeah.
So yeah, that'd be really good if we can.
But let's see.
Yeah.
Let's
So,
not
and the
move
other
this.
long-term plan is to extend the test suite to process modelling environments. And here we're definitely going to need the input of people who produce modelling environments, because this is a significantly different level of technical difficulty, I think. And because there is it's not a simple, we can't automate the driving of a PME. We've got to, the PME has got to be driven by the owners of the PME to do the testing. So
The way I see it is we can make software that plugs in as a PMC in the PME to be tested and essentially puts instructions with checkboxes up on the screen, do this now, and it's monitoring that those actions are being performed and checked off. So in principle, you can automate that. If you have a mouse recorder in your own PME, you can go through the process and make it go through the steps automatically.
And you've just talked to my next slide, Jasper.
Sorry.
Thank you. No, that's fine. Jasper just said exactly that. That is the plan. that we produce reference PMCs that can be plugged into the PME. We produce a list of instructions that, as in an ideal world, if they could be just a document that the PME owner needs to follow, or it could be a list of instructions that pop up on the screen and you just say done that, done that, done that, and you work through it and you capture the mouse clicks as you're doing it if you want, and then you can automate the process.
You don't even have to say done that, because that can be observed from the test PMC.
Okay. Yes, that's true.
But should it then still be possible to run this test after this action automatically?
That's what Malcolm was saying. We cannot do it automatically because it requires certain actions to be triggered by the PME, which is typically a graphical user interface. So
yeah, but after you have done this once,
if you
record it,
if you mouse and keylog,
automating capabilities of the PME, if you can run it automatically.
Yeah, I think we should maybe look at. There are also test frameworks for graphical user interfaces, so possibly if we combine it a little bit with that, then it could run also in an automated way after it was executed once manually.
And I've just skipped back one slide because you're now discussing levels of automation, scope of PMEs, and all this sort of stuff. You're answering the questions I'm asked. No, that's fine. I'm not. But I want other people in the meeting to answer the questions as well. So that to me covers the test suite. I'm in interest of time, given it's now 2:45. Certification side of all this. The test suite just enables certification. We've got to do other things to actually deliver certification. It's an extra step on top of the test suite. And no progress has been made since last year because we've been focusing on the test suite, because the test suite is an essential prerequisite for certification. But a quick recap of the proposal, and I'm going to whistle through this. Developer implementing the Cape Open interfaces downloads the test suite. They can test their implementation during the development cycle, running both the certification tests and the best practice tests. And these slides are straight from last year, so it doesn't refer to best practice, but in the context of the previous ones, that's certification and best practice. In the fullness of time, the test suite will have the ability for vendors to put their own tests in there. It doesn't have it currently, but you may want to run tests that are unique to yourselves. The certification step, though, is you run the test suite using the certification test libraries. Sorry, certification test categories. Get it right tip. And you run it on the final release candidate of the new version of the software, and you submit the report to the Chief Certification Officer. So that's what the vendor does, the developer does. Then the CCO reviews that test report. They do not rerun those tests. It is reliant on the honesty of the developer, that they submit that report as is. We haven't put any security on that file or anything else. But we're a community. I don't believe anybody would try and falsify that report. The CCO will request additional information, clarification if it is required. For example, if an interface that would normally be mandatory doesn't exist, but there is a specific reason why it doesn't need to exist. For example, a property package only has one compound in it and deals with that one compound and deals with very specific conditions and so on. Some mandatory interfaces may not need to exist in that scenario, so the CCO may request that information to understand why. And when compliance is established, the CCO grants a certificate for the version of the software tested, notifies the software developer and publishes the result. And if compliance is not established, there's a feedback loop, and it's a two-part feedback loop, because compliance may not have been established because we've just discovered a defect in the test suite, in which case it needs to be addressed, and compliance may not have been achieved because of a defect in the actual application, in which case that needs to be addressed. So there's a loop in there. So that is a very detailed diagram. You probably can't read it. I split it up last year, but it is exactly the same one as I showed last year. Chief Certification Officer reporting to the Management Board, responsible for the certification process and policy, responsible for the test suite and the certification website, and interacting with the software developers, being advised by the Chief Technology Officer. The interoperability SIG basically leads the contribution to the, it owns the test suite. So when the Chief Certification Officer says, I need this done to the test suite, it's the interoperability SIG's responsibility for making sure it happens. So it is the interoperability SIG that will liaise with the other individual SIGs around documentation of tests, review and so on, and will liaise with the development resource for making this stuff get done. The funding proposal for the test suite is that it's available to all CO-LaN members of any category, whether you're full member, associate member, groups A, B or C. But it's for use on your software only. Sorry, it's for use on software owned by a CO-LaN member only. So if, and I'm going to use the example that Oliver came up with yesterday, if Lindy wants to test somebody else's software using the test suite before they use it, they can do that as long as that somebody else is a member of CO-LaN. Perfectly acceptable. But you can't test on behalf of somebody else who's not a member of CO-LaN, because the way you get access to it is by joining. Because otherwise, if you start testing for non-CO-LaN members, you break the funding model. So we're not asking for any money for the test suite itself. If you're a member, you get it. And that will need to be reviewed by 2025 at the latest, when the current membership fee arrangements are reviewed. Because if at that point we decided that the associate members didn't need to pay, there may not be enough funding for the test suite, and we might decide to start charging for the test suite instead. So it will be reviewed along with the associate membership or the membership fees review in 2025 at the latest. Requests for certification will initially start with unlimited requests, but we will review that annually, because the process of certifying may be a significant cost to CO-LaN. And if we're doing it for free based on the membership fees, but everybody is requesting lots of certification every year, then there may not be enough money to fund it. In which case we might need to review whether it's free or how many times a member is allowed to request certification each year. But organisations that are not members of CO-LaN cannot request certification, so they don't have access to the test suite to produce the report. They've got to join if they want certification. And that is how we fund the test suite and certification, is through the membership fee. There is no separate funding for these things.
At least at the moment.
At the moment, until we review. Yes, indeed. We may review, we may change that come 2025. So the next steps for certification: finalise the proposals based on the feedback from the CO-LaN members, and I will be doing that. And we've had a fair amount of feedback, but that is the current state. So if you want to feedback more, you do it now, or separately to me after the meeting. If you think there's something significantly wrong in that proposal, I'd be interested in hearing.
What's the plan for challenging the certification? If somebody has certified and something breaks in interaction with somebody else's software and you want to challenge certification, has that been considered?
That will have to be, that's a good point, that will have to be considered.
Okay.
I think, I have a vague memory we have considered it already, but I can't remember what the conclusion was. And it definitely needs to be considered next year as part of the proposals. Yes. It will then be approved by the management board, and we hope to do that by the end of next year. Now we actually have a working test suite, even if it hasn't got a full set of tests in it. End of next year is probably right for that approval. Then the management board will appoint a chief certification officer, possibly in 2023, but only if all the prerequisites are in place, and there's a necessity to make the appointment. not mandating that the management board appoint a CCO next year. It would be, if we're in a situation where it's needed, it will happen. And we're trying to get everything else lined up by the end of next year, so it might be a requirement for next year. But if it's not, it won't be done.